my whole purpose of doing the podcast is to educate as well as celebrate our seniors, and especially our really cool inspirational seniors, which there are so many of. But that's like one of my favorite things about the podcast, that it's just, there's so many avenues to go with it, and just that one piece of content, and then we're taking it and just putting it out all over the place. Well, the other thing that I find myself doing pretty frequently is, obviously my business is helping people find senior housing, or helping them along if they're, on a journey with dementia or whatever it may be. And I've been talking to a family member who is upset because mom's been diagnosed with dementia, or dad has. And so I said, you know what? We have a great episode. I interviewed a wonderful lady. She talked all about her journey, beginning to end, all the different types of care. Let me send you a link to that. And so I use the podcast in that way a lot. Or if someone has a question, like, I don't really understand what independent living is, I explain to them, but I'm like, I'm going to also send you a podcast link. And I always ask, do you listen to podcasts? Most people do say yes. And I'm very excited to say that, my age group, the 50 plus, we really are listening to podcasts a lot now. Welcome to Aging in Style with me, Lori Williams. I'm an optimist by nature, and I believe you can follow your dreams at any age. My grandmother's journey with dementia ignited a passion in me to work with seniors. I've spent the past 13 years learning about seniors and aging. In my mid-50s, I followed my own dream and founded my company, where I use my expertise to help seniors locate housing and resources. On this podcast, we cover all aspects of aging. Join us each week to meet senior living experts and inspirational seniors who are following their dreams. The fact is, we're all aging, so why not do it in style? Hi, welcome to today's episode of Aging in Style. And today is a very, very special episode because it is our, drum roll please, 100th podcast episode. 100. That is shocking to me. When I started this podcast, I don't know. I didn't know how many episodes there would be. I didn't have 100. That just seemed a long ways off, but we did it. So doing the podcast is not something that I do on my own. I have a very special lady who is my producer, and you probably heard me mention her name. If you've been a guest on the podcast, you've heard me mention her name. So it's Xavier, and she owns the podcast space. She is a podcast whiz kid or whiz lady, I guess. And I want to introduce her to you now. So welcome, Anna.
Hi, Lori. Thanks for having me again. I'm so excited to be here talking about not only your 100th episode, but also something that you put so much time and passion into. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much. So Anna has been on before, and I have talked in the past about the podcast and what kind of led me to creating one. But I want to go back and kind of give you a little history. So I was a co-host on a podcast prior to this one. And I think we only did like 10 episodes, and it was very different. It was video and it was live, and Anna was our producer, which is how I met her at the time. And the funny thing about that one was when my friend asked me if I would be her co-host, it was called The Girlfriend's Guide to Senior Living. So if you haven't seen it, go look it up. It's a really fun podcast. I had no idea what a podcast was. And I had to ask my son, who I guess he was probably about 23 or so at the time. And he always had like his AirPods or whatever they're called in all the time, always listening to something, but I had no idea it was podcasts he was listening to. So he explained to me what a podcast was. I told him what I was thinking about doing. And I was 55 at the time that we did that podcast. So it was really outside my comfort zone to do it, but it was so much fun. And Anna made it a lot of fun too. And so after we did that, we only did, like I said, about 10 episodes, I think. And then I just continued working with my business, and then COVID happened. But all along in the back of my mind, I was thinking, I want to do a podcast because I love the way that there's so much information that can be shared with people, because I can only talk to so many people in one day. But by doing a podcast, I can reach so many more people outside of, Dallas, Texas. I can reach people all over the country, all over the world, and share information that I think is helpful to all about aging and about housing and resources. And so that's kind of the backstory with why the podcast and why we are now at 100 podcasts.
Yes. And it's funny, Laura, you were saying like, oh, I was co-hosting the show and I wasn't sure. And it was just something that you just kind of fell into because you were co-hosting. You kind of came along a little bit later to that show. And it's funny because the moment I saw you come into the studio, you had such confidence and you were just ready to have fun and share educational content, which I feel like that's how most people don't go into podcasting. I could sense that your mission, your goal of educating and helping others was way bigger than potentially like feeling a little scared of trying something new. So I knew that you were special when as soon as you got into the studio, there was just some aura. And so I can really tell when someone is passionate and is excited to just like really push themselves and their business to the next thing. And you say that at the back of your mind after doing that show, you were like, oh, I may be doing that show. After I left that job because in early 2020, that's when I launched my business. And you were always in my mind to reach out to and be like, hey, if you ever want to start a podcast, think of me as your producer. Because I mean, at the time, I just thought I want to work with people who really love what they do. They're passionate. They want to make the world a better place. And so you stayed on my mind and I did reach out to you and you're like, well, also, I've been thinking about podcasts. So it's just so perfect that like the stars aligned.
We were in sync there. It's like, okay, yeah. Cause I mean, like I said, I kept thinking about it, but there's a lot to it. And I am not that tech savvy to figure it out. But I mean, not only that, but just finding the time. And when did you call me?
One of the things that you do very well, and this is like just kind of like a love fest on you, but you do promote what you're doing. You are very active on social media. You know where your audience is. You know they're on Facebook. And you just keep sharing what you're doing. And I always kept up with what you were doing on Facebook. And I did message you on Facebook. That's how and it was just so funny because you're like, well, I've been thinking about that too. And it's interesting because during the pandemic, it was just so scary. A lot of people were afraid of getting outside the house, and doing the show during that time was perfect because you could reach people when they were in their houses, right? And couldn't go anywhere. And probably they were just so afraid because they're like, I don't know what to do. Mom and dad are in a situation that I can't help with, and I'm unsure of what to do next. So I think it was a really perfect timing to launch your show.
I think so too. And the other thing that a lot of people don't know, unless they've been a guest on the show, is that we aren't face to face. We do it via Zoom. So that again was perfect during COVID because you're not like having to go into a studio. Whereas the first podcast I did, we would go to a studio because it was you could see us and it was live, and that was a little bit nerve-wracking, but but we did it.
Yes. Let's just be very, very real here. Like a lot of times stuff happens when you're recording, right? Like you had how many times like things went south and you just kind of like dusted off and like, all right, let's try again.
Exactly. And Anna has a whole blooper reel on me that
yes,
that will not be shared publicly because it's pretty funny. But, things happen and you just have to, you keep going and you keep learning. And I would say definitely since show 1 to show 100, I have learned so much and I am just so much more confident in interviewing people, knowing what to ask. And yeah, I think practice makes perfect, and
yes, 1000%. And that's actually one of the reasons why most people give up with podcasting is because it is a really long-term commitment to a project. It's not like social media. Social media is you create something, and especially right now on TikTok and Instagram, people think that you share things one time and you go viral. And it's not always like that, but there's a better chance of you growing faster on social media than on podcasting. Because here's the truth. Podcasting is a different medium than YouTube, for instance, or social media. You normally don't stumble on a podcast like, let me Google podcasts about senior housing or senior living. You normally get a recommendation from someone who told you, hey, I love these podcasts. You have to listen to it. Or as I did the other day, actually, a friend of mine was experiencing some family difficulties. This family member was diagnosed with dementia and Alzheimer's. And so she was like, oh my God, we're so overwhelmed. And I was like, I have a podcast for you. Or you follow already someone. So let's say people who follow you already, Lori, and when you announced you had a podcast, they subscribed. Now, people don't go on podcast platforms like you would do on YouTube. You search how to, how to garden in the summer without, burning out plants. Like, it's not the same thing. So a lot of people go into that mindset of like, oh, it's just like social media. And it's not. It takes longer.
Mm-mm. Yeah, and we talked about that before that. I mean, it is a commitment when you start a podcast. You can't just put out 10 podcasts and then, it didn't go viral or you don't have sponsors or whatever. That's pretty much what you see, that podcasters don't give it long enough to catch on, right?
Yes. So as an average, and this is like something that I'm going to nerd out a little bit on numbers, but I promise that the numbers promise the numbers that I'm going to share are like interesting for you. So most people listen to about 8 episodes a week. But what's interesting, though, is that actually the 55 plus community has been listening to podcasts more and more. So we're looking about like 20 million Americans. And of course, that will increase because people are aging, people live longer, right? So there's also, if you think about like the amount of information that's available, people now have speakers, smart speakers. So people can actually talk to the smart speakers and ask for things. And you don't need to be necessarily tech savvy to access podcasts because your speaker will find whatever podcast you need. If you just say the term podcast, it will search for a show that matches your criteria. And so a lot of people are aware of the term podcasting more now than they were 5 years ago. And so, if you were to access information, you would go probably to YouTube. And it's just you have to turn on the computer. There's a lot of steps involved in that. But with smart speakers, you don't have to do that anymore. So I think
when you say smart speakers, you mean like Alexa?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So I didn't say that because I have one connected right next to me.
Oh.
Actually, funny thing, the reason why, actually, I call it another name, but I'm sure I would accidentally call it. But during Podcast Movement 2 years ago, which is a podcaster conference that happens here in Dallas, there was a virtual one, obviously, because of COVID. And Mark Cuban had one, and he was talking exactly about smart speakers, and his smart speaker would constantly go off. And this was live.
Oh, that is hilarious. That is too funny.
Yes.
So I'll say it and hopefully yours won't go off. But Alexa, and I know I have told my mother because she can't ever find my podcast. So I'm like, just say, Alexa, play Aging in Style. And that will happen. Now, I will say that some of my favorite hysterical senior friends, they tell me they can't remember the name Alexa and they call her all kinds of things, other names. But someone did tell me you can reprogram it to a different name. Is that true? You could program your Alexa and give her. Okay, so you could.
You can, but I think because I changed mine, and you can even call it computer, which is weird.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, but that's actually, I think that was an SNL sketch exactly about that. How seniors kept calling Alexa all these different names, or they forgot what they were asking. Anyway, so to give a long-winded answer to your question, I forgot what you asked. Oh my God.
More people 55 and up are accessing. Look at you. I have a show for you to listen to. No, I'm kidding.
Oh my goodness.
I'll text you that episode. No, I'm kidding.
Yes. Yeah, right. So you see, this is why I let Lori be the talent, because clearly I'm just so distracted having fun on the other side that I need to be editing. All right. So so more and more people are consuming podcasts, right? But it does take about a year, 6 months to a year, depending on how engaged your community is, to actually see some benefit. And podcasting growth and making, a lot of people will go, I want to make money out of my podcast, or I want to be famous immediately. It does take a minimum from 6 to 12 months to be able to do that. But I think that one of the things that is important for people to know is that when you are sharing content, you will never run out of ideas. And you, Lori, we have monthly calls about just ideas and planning and structure and grow the podcast even more. And I mean, you're always texting me.
I know. I will never run out of an idea. There's so many things. And, things are always coming up. Or if I'm on LinkedIn or Facebook and I see someone share something, I'm always writing down, okay, I need to remember this because this is a great idea for a podcast. So the other thing, Anna, that when I started the podcast, I didn't realize this. And this is like one of my favorite things about doing a podcast. We do one every week. And there's automatically content to take from that and repurpose it into social media. So my Facebook post, my Instagram, it all like takes from the content what we just learned, like we did adaptive clothing. I mean, there's so many things we can share about that people, and as I hope everyone knows, my whole purpose of doing the podcast is to educate as well as celebrate our seniors, and especially our really cool inspirational seniors, which there are so many of. But that's like one of my favorite things about the podcast, that it's just, there's so many avenues to go with it, and just that one piece of content, and then we're taking it and just putting it out all over the place. Well, the other thing that I find myself doing pretty frequently is, obviously my business is helping people find senior housing, or helping them along with, if they're, in a journey with dementia or whatever it may be. And I've been talking to a family member who is upset because mom's been diagnosed with dementia, or dad has. And so I said, you know what? We have a great episode. I interviewed a wonderful lady. She talked all about her journey, beginning to end, all the different types of care. Let me send you a link to that. And so I use the podcast in that way a lot. Or if someone has a question, like, I don't really understand what independent living is, I explain to them, but I'm like, I'm going to also send you a podcast link. And I always ask, do you listen to podcasts? Most people do say yes. And I'm very excited to say that, my age group, the 50 plus, we really are listening to podcasts a lot now. So most people are listening, and they may not have ever sought out my podcast, but I send them a link. They listen to that. And then a lot of times they'll say, oh, I listened to some others. And as I've told you, Anna, because I get so excited when this happens, I've had people call me and say, I found you on your podcast.
I love it.
And we get really excited when we hear that.
Yes. And that's the thing, when you podcast, your content really stops being local. You really reach out to a bigger audience. I mean, even though you highlight a lot of people from Flower Mound, and right in the beginning, you did cover a lot of, because I mean, that's what you've met these people, they're incredibly knowledgeable. So it makes sense. But then you had, wasn't it from Arizona or someone that reached out months ago, and they were like, oh my God, I found you randomly.
Yeah, from all over. I mean, and a lot of people that I have now interviewed, they heard the podcast and they were in another state and they reached out to me. So I had a lady from Boston, the lady, Catherine Esty, who's an author. I have a lady in Michigan who reached out, I have a gentleman in Arizona. And so they're just, people who were listening and said, I really like your podcast. I'd like to share my story. And they had incredible stories to share. So I love that it's helping me reach out from my backyard, reach out all over the country and world to reach more people.
Yeah, and I think that idea, you touched on it earlier. So like most people, the average person listens to 8 podcasts a week, but the 55 plus age group listens to about 5 per week. So think about it, when you are doing things, again, during COVID, people were lonely. People didn't know what to do. They felt like they didn't want to probably turn on the TV. They didn't want to read. And so listening to someone, you pick up on their warmth. It's just the closest to having a conversation, right? Especially like a podcast like yours, which is very conversational. You get to hear 2 people talking about something, and that, one, keeps you company, but also at the same time, you're consuming information in a way that is very attainable. And it just makes you feel like you are very intimate to that person. I mean, how many times have you had calls and people were like, oh my God, you sound just like in your podcast?
Yes, that does happen. And I've even had someone stop me in person, which was really fun. I told you about that too. I'm like, oh, my little celebrity moment.
So they were like, oh, I heard your voice before. Was that?
Yeah. Oh, I know who you are. I've listened to your podcast, because I mean, if you go to my podcast, it does have my picture on there. But that was really kind of a little freaky, but funny and cool, right. All kind of at the same time.
I think that's awesome, and especially at the same time, as a brand, you've been working in senior housing for over 15 years?
Over 15 years.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you are known locally, obviously, because you're always in the communities and doing all types of events. But I mean, you're also becoming someone who is, because you're doing the podcast, people, instead of just seeing you on the street, now they can listen to you. And it just creates that connection that you wouldn't get from reading a blog post or from, checking out a social media post. And I think that that's one of the main reasons why people love podcasting so much is that you can really get a sense of someone through the show. Don't get me wrong. I come from a radio background, so I also know that there are people who have a personality on air and that they're completely different when they're not. But most podcasters, they really show you who they are through the show. And I mean, that's one of the best things, right? Someone coming up to you and they feel like already know you. It makes, especially if they are distressed, they are on what you call normally a 911 situation, right? It just helps build that trust faster.
And they feel comfortable. And I mean, I think also like to be successful doing a podcast, you have to be your true, genuine, authentic self. And I think I definitely am. I have my goofs that we leave in a lot of times too, and the ones that we don't. But, I think it does build that instant relationship if they have been listening to the podcast. And the other part of it is it establishes you as the expert in your field because you're on the podcast, you're putting yourself out there, and it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. Like you can go, okay, I'm going to do a podcast. I was so nervous when I made the commitment. I said it, I'm going to do it. But I think you may know, maybe you didn't know, but I was very nervous about it. And then it, like the first 5 to 6, it just was kind of like just push yourself and just get through it. And then I realized you don't have to be perfect. And I think a lot of people think that I've got to do this perfectly. Well, especially if you're doing, Anna knows this, if I'm doing a podcast, a solo one by myself, the blooper reel on that is going to be R-rated. And so no one is going to hear that. Because it's harder to do the solo ones because you don't have someone that you're having a conversation with. And so those have taken me a minute to get more comfortable with and do. But those are important as well, because again, you're hearing my voice as an authority on something that I am passionate about, that I have researched, that I know a lot about, which is senior living.
And that is true. I mean, it is a big thing, right? Like it's your show. It's not like an article or a blog post that you can edit later. You can really sense so much. It's so vulnerable. And that's one of the reasons why people don't start a podcast, because they feel they are too vulnerable. And I think that having a big mission like you do really helps you overcome this. Because at the end of the day, you think people need to listen to this. Instead of like, and again, it's also like the trust process. Like I've been pushing you as well. And you know that I only push you because I know that you can do it. But it's just like, if you don't have someone who really believes in you, but yes, solo episodes is the single thing that I think is the most important to establish trust. And the reason for that is when you're doing an interview, you can be the best. I mean, Oprah, right? Like Oprah is a great interviewer. However, when you're interviewing, for most people, when you're interviewing someone else, you're highlighting them, the guest. So it's so important to combine interviews with other people to talk about things that you don't know about, right? Or that you just want to highlight. And solo episodes, because you're able to share your story, you're able to share your wisdom, your expertise, all of that in a way that an interview can't. But you always share stories of like, hey, I'm talking about this because I got a call from someone and that reminded me that I haven't done a podcast episode about that. And I think that it's huge when you really are aware of the impact that you're having when you're podcasting. You're like, oh, there's this one topic that I need to talk about. And sometimes we create what it's called the micro episode. So anything that is kind of like under 10 minutes or just pretty much under 20 minutes is considered a micro episode. And still those are sometimes one of your most listened ones because people sometimes they're stressed out, they're panicking. And those 10 minutes, you put them at ease because they have actionable tips. They know what their next steps are, but they also know they're like, oh, okay, everything is kind of temporary and there's a solution for things. And I think that's when you you really shine is just making people kind of like, hey, I've been here for long enough. Let's work through things.
And, I'm always happy when I complete a micro episode and it's a solo one. I'm happy when it's done. It's just doing it. But again, and this is what I have loved about having you as my producer, is that you have pushed me outside my comfort zone. Because if I were trying to do this podcast on my own, I wouldn't do it. But I hear what you're saying when we have a meeting and you tell me the reason why I need to do this, how it's going to help. And then I'm like, she's right. And I'm not going to let her down. I'm going to do it. But I love that you give me that push, because Anna will say something and I'm thinking in my mind, oh, there's no way. And then I'm like, no, I can do it. I'm going to do it because I know you believe I can. And I just appreciate that so much.
Well, thank you. And I think that also we've been working together for a long time now. Mm-hmm. And so I also understand what you're doing. And sometimes it's just conversations, even with my own family, that I'm like, oh, I need this type of content. Lori, do you want to do an episode of that? Because the truth is, if I'm thinking about it, if I'm going through something that I need help with, you've heard it 1,000 times, mm-hmm. right? And you have really exciting episodes coming up that I think that not a lot of people talk about. Some things that you are going to be talking is kind of like teasing, woo, like we have some exciting episodes. But it's true. Sometimes there are things that you don't want to research online, or you maybe research and feel overwhelmed. And when you're having someone explain that to you, it just makes it easier. Mm-hmm. And every episode goes on your website anyway, but it's still so important to hear it from you. And in a way that 15 years of experience in an industry, there's something about you've seen it all pretty much, right?
Yeah. Well, you think you've seen it all, but then you haven't.
Fair.
You that you've never seen it all. I will say this also about having the guest on the podcast. I learn from every episode as well. Each person, because they are maybe in a different side of things, maybe, an occupational therapist or someone who owns a residential care home or whatever it may be, someone who is 87 years old explaining what it's like to be in your 80s. I mean, to me, it's fascinating to learn these things, especially to hear directly from an older adult, to hear their experience. Because, God willing, we're all going to be in our 80s and 90s one day, right?
Right.
Which kind of, like I said in the beginning, the whole purpose of the podcast was education and celebrating inspirational seniors. But I feel like it's moved more into almost like a platform to celebrate aging, because I think it's so important. I feel like in our society, we look down on people who are older. We don't give them the value that they should have. And I think that's really important. And I love some of the people that we've talked to give them a platform. As I said, the lady, Catherine Esty, who talked about her book, what it is like to be 80.
And aging like a guru was a great episode on talking about being a post-child.
Yeah, absolutely. And about, things we don't think about, that people are actually happier in their 80s. There's something to aspire to, but also how to age well and to, have a passion to always do more. And I feel like, I guess I knew some of that, but the more I talk to people, that I feel like, yes, this is what we need to be sharing. And so I love that also about the podcast. That gives me a platform to share that and then to have guests on to share as well.
You were talking about aging. One of the things that you do very well with the show is leading with curiosity. And, starting a show does not need to be something that you monetize. If you are 50 and over, you're trying to try a new career, or you maybe worked all your life and you're trying to find something to find purpose. I mean, today, right now, there's so much technology. Anchor is a platform that allows you to just start your show just easily, or using a platform like Descript, which you record an audio, you upload it to your computer, and you edit the audio through a script. So, I mean, how easy is that? You don't need to know about leveling audio, making edits, all those things. And I think that just as a rule of thumb on your show is, hey, I don't know, but let's figure it out.
Mm-hmm. So, like you're saying, if someone, say they're 65, they've retired, they know everything about sailing. and they want to make a podcast, but it's just for fun and to share with their friends, they could easily go on to Anchor or any of these other ones and just make a podcast. Why not?
Yeah. Or even just go on Facebook, like that lady who does parachuting. What's her name?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Aging but Dangerous. She is amazing. Yeah.
Yes. She does like a Facebook Live every week or something. And she just talks.
Yeah. Cocktails with, what is it? Mornings with Jean and then cocktails with Jean. Yeah.
We'll have all of the links.
Yeah, we will.
Yes, we'll have all of the links in the show notes in the description so you can listen to all of these episodes. But yeah, she was talking about how, she just jumps off planes, and she inspires other ladies to just try something new. And one of the things they talk about on your podcast is like really trying something and just finding a purpose. And I mean, if it's just documenting your life story, by the way, I have a friend who she knew she wanted to do a podcast with her grandma, and her grandma has since passed. But what she did was she's recording the conversations with her grandma, which I can't reveal much because obviously like I don't have her approval to share this. But I know that her grandma was someone who was just a visionary, daredevil. She was really trying to pave the way for other women. And she started recording conversations with her grandma, and she will want to turn that into a series. But again, it's just like, even if she never releases any of that, she will have those recordings for her. And it's the same thing for you if you want to start a podcast, because a podcast can be something that is just audio, video, whatever it is, just a Facebook Live that you then, use and learn like baby steps, right? Like just start going live on Facebook and talk to people. I mean, sometimes just starting with, there's these podcasts that I would listen to, it would be a 3-minute broadcast every single day with something inspirational. I mean, how great is that? If you are a thinker and you want to share, especially if you're in your 80s and you want to say, hey, today, 10 years ago, I was doing this. Today, think about, what do you need to do to be there? Or like, what is your goal in life? Whatever it is, if you want to share it, just do it because it will live after you. And what a legacy to leave your family with, all of these stories, all of these wisdom. Like, it's a way to keep your memory alive. I think it got into a little of a dark turn, but I just think it's important.
I love that. No, I think that's great. It goes to show you, I mean, podcasts are not going anywhere. They're just growing. There's more and more. How many podcasts are there? Did I ask you that?
No, you didn't, but that's a very good question. So there are. And this is what I love telling people. So, when like years ago, people were like, everybody had a blog and everybody is like a streamer. Well, it may appear as so with podcasting. There are over 2 million podcasts, but only 200,000 are actually active. Because, and this is like about 10%. So think about, if you want to start a podcast, hey, there's no such thing as 2 million podcasts as competition. Just, there isn't. But the truth is, we're talking about consistency. Most people, 90% of people don't even make it to episode 10. So,
wow. And we're at 100. 100! I just had to throw that out there.
Yes. And here's the thing. People may think about like, oh, I need the camera. Oh, I need the blah, blah, blah. Or like, I don't have a budget to pay like a really fancy producer, or I need to build my studio first. And those are just, I think, excuses that people find to not start, because content matters more than anything. This is like a strategy telling you, get your message out there. People relate to, unless your show is about an audio experience like those ASMR shows where it's just people tapping on microphones or recording the sounds of things.
My daughter loves those. I don't get it, but yeah, she loves those.
Because it's like white noise. It's like mindfulness. You're just focusing on that sound and just brings you kind of peace. That's why. So just kind of like just chills your brain. But going back to what I was saying, those are just excuses just because you're afraid of putting yourself out there. And so it's just so important to think, just start doing it, right? Like just do it scared and just move forward. Because, I mean, if you ever thought that you would be on episode number 100, right, Lori? Yeah,
no, I never thought. I mean, I hoped we would make it to 100, but man, we did it pretty quick. I mean, 2 years.
Yeah.
Because of consistency. And there, I'm going to tell you, there were some weeks that I'm like, oh my gosh, I have got to get a podcast done because I was so busy, things going on. As Anna always says, you need to batch your podcast, record a whole bunch in advance. And I have been doing really good at that lately. But there were times that I was like, I don't know if I'm going to make it this week, but I usually did.
Right. And sometimes that's when we would do, okay, let's record a shorter episode.
Mm-hmm.
Or that's when we go, okay, let's use a replay and use an older episode, because people will consume episodes by title. Or if they had a very busy week, they may have never listened to your episode. They missed it. So if you had an older episode and you're like, oh, sure, this is great time to use that. So it does not need to be something that is overwhelming. And if you're not enjoying it, then find a different way to do it, like shorter episodes, or just take a break and do seasons. And I think that with you had a bit of a problem that is a good problem to have, which is your company grew so much that we were like, all right, let's try to start batching because you get so busy.
We did. And I know, and what's so funny is at one point last year, I'm like, I just don't know that I have enough time to find people to talk to. And then right after I said that, because I said, let's just do every other week. Right after I said that, I get a call from the Alzheimer's Association. And they're like, hey, we'd love to do a monthly podcast with you. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there's the sign. Okay. And then I called Anna back. Never mind. Just kidding. We're doing weekly podcasts. We're continuing on. And that's been some of the best content. And I've learned so much in those shows too.
I mean, and also like even on personal goals, probably that partnership would have never happened had you not had a podcast. Right.
No, it wouldn't have. Yeah.
So it's just
they've invited me to be on a roundtable with them and share information to their listeners. So it's amazing to me where a podcast can lead you.
That is absolutely true.
Opens lots of doors. I think we've covered a lot about what podcasts are and who listens, and that you can be any age and start a podcast and listen to a podcast. And if you're thinking about starting one, just do it. And just, if you want it to be something that lives on, if you want to reach 100 episodes, then, you just have to stay with it. Pick something you're passionate about that you won't get tired of talking about.
Exactly. And let me do my own plug right now. So I have my own company, which is called the Podcast Space. We are more than just a company doing service for clients. So we actually have a lot of resources, because just like you, I'm so passionate about helping people really grow their idea. And again, it's just sometimes you don't want, if you may not have a budget, but you have a great idea, or maybe you're just like trying it out and see how it works. We have a lot of resources on the website for beginners. So there's no excuse I have a whole article on how to start a podcast. So you can just go there and just read it and just take your time and follow the Podcast Space on social media, because we share so many easy to follow resources. Nothing is ever advanced, because I just truly believe that everyone has something to say and some way to contribute to the world, and podcasting is it.
And Anna has an incredible Instagram. You have some of the funniest. I love your posts so much. The one you did with Diego, your husband, I watched that like 20 times. I showed it to Abby and we just laughed and laughed because your facial expressions were so funny. But Anna is so creative, and she sends a newsletter out. And I read all your tips too when you send them out. And she's on LinkedIn, and you're doing TikTok too, aren't you?
I am on TikTok, which is just repurposing to go on other platforms. A lot of people think, oh, you have to be everywhere. Like, you don't. You just have to pick, where is my audience, and just create content that is catered to that audience. Just putting your information out there with a mindset of, okay, people need to listen to this, but I'm also going to have fun. So I think that's the most benefit. And I appreciate that you listen and you follow along and you support me, because I think that that's one of the most important things, is to have fun while creating all of this resources, because it is about having fun.
Absolutely. And you do it all well.
Thank you.
I couldn't do it without you, Anna. And you are so much fun. We laugh a lot during our monthly strategy meetings.
We do. We have so much fun. I think you love what you're doing. This is your calling. This is my calling. And so it's just fireworks when we get together. That's why.
Yes, it is. Well, thank you so much for all you do and for coming on here. There's no one else I'd rather have on my 100th episode but you, Anna. couldn't do it without you.
Well,
And keep pushing me. We've got some plans, some things coming up where we're going to push me outside, like way outside my comfort zone. So it's all good, but I appreciate you so much.
Same. I appreciate you too, Lori. Thank you for having me. And yay, congrats. We're going to do some toasting after turning off. We're going to be toasting to your 100th episode because this is worth celebrating for sure.
It is. It's going to be a big celebration for sure. So, well, thank you all for listening. And you can go to my website, which is loriwilliams-seniorservices.com, and click on the podcast tab, and you can see all 100 podcasts or listen to all 100 podcasts there. So, if you've got nothing to do tonight, just, start listening at number 1. I'm just kidding. But go back and listen anytime. And thank you for supporting the podcast and sharing it with your friends. Thanks. And we will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.